So moving on swiftly, we have 4 speakers speaking on effects today. Maybe a little less on the lights, please. The first is going to be Alesia, Rong, Mark, and Bharat. They are going to give disparate presentations, each 7 minutes, and then we're going to have a group conversation. These presentations are fascinating. Putting together these decks was really a highlight of my year. We have some brilliant minds in front of us. Born and raised in South Los Angeles, Alesia Montgomery is an assistant professor at UCLA's Institute of Environment and Sustainability. An ethnographer, Montgomery studies the social and environmental justice concerns of low-income racialized communities. Her current research centers on the challenges of Black and Latina mothers who strive to protect their families from extreme heat in South LA. Her book, Greening the Black Urban Regime, The Culture and Commerce of Sustainability in Detroit, focuses on battles over the aims and strategies of green redevelopment. Following Alesia, Rong Fu is a climate researcher and a professor in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences and the director of the Joint Institute for Earth System Science and Engineering at UCLA. Her research is among the earliest to observationally uncover significant roles of tropical rainforests in determining rainfall seasonality over Amazonia and the Tibetan Plateau, in determining water vapor transport to global stratosphere. So we were talking a bit about water vapor earlier, and it's a significant actor in the creation of climate change. She is co-leader of the NOAA Drought Task Force Phase 4. Dr. Bharat Venkat is an associate professor at UCLA at the Institute of Society and Genetics, the Department of History, and the Department of Anthropology. His first book, At the Limits of Cure, is the winner of 3 major literary awards. His current book project, titled Swelter, A History of Our Bodies in a Warming World, is about thermal inequality, the history of heat, and the fate of our bodies in a swiftly warming world riven by inequality. Swelter will be published by Crown in the United States and Picador in the UK. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Mark Stoll. He's here, is a professor of environmental history at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. His latest book, Profit and Environmental History, tells the long story of the mounting ecological toll that capitalism has exacted. Stoll's earlier work explored unintended ways that religious belief has shaped ideas about nature and the environment. Throughout his career, Stoll has investigated how the same cultural and social forces that caused the environmental crisis also fostered an environmental movement in optimism. Alesia, would you like to begin?
My thanks to MOCA for inviting me to speak with you today. So to begin, I'm going to be reading from my notes because I want to try to keep within the time limit. So as the planet warms, extreme weather events such as Hurricane Milton that recently hit Florida are becoming more frequent and severe. Across the Americas, racialized geographies intensified the dangers. In the US, low-income residents of Black, Latino, and Indigenous communities are more likely to die from extreme weather. In the tropics, warming trends in southern Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean are projected to increase deadly droughts, storms, and floods that may drive migration. Their vulnerability is a product of converging disasters. So you've already heard about climate change. So that's on one hand, there's climate change. On the other hand, the rise of racial capitalism in the early modern era, rooted in Europe, spreading via settler colonialism, set in motion the material and ideological conditions that made racialized people disposable. This slide frames these converging disasters in an unsettling poetics. The first quote and the satellite image of Hurricane Milton, scraps of found poetry and art from NOAA, the acronym for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration within the Department of Commerce, a homophone that conjures the biblical Noah. And the second quote from the late great poet of Watts, Wanda Coleman, who warns, in a bitter twist on the national anthem, it's raining dirty water all over America. The arcs are slowly filling with unknown species and new breeds. What happened to the brave? Have they departed with the free? Think of the gutters crammed with souls, gone needlessly to waste. Research indicates that we are moving to a new normal of hotter temperatures across the US. In Los Angeles County and across the US, urban heat island effects, the intensification of heat by buildings and roads, disproportionately impact the health of racialized and low-income groups. Historically, racist policies in the early 20th century, including redlining, disinvestment in Black and immigrant neighborhoods, led to infrastructure inequities such as fewer parks, fewer streets with leafy shade, that continue to shape exposure to high temperatures. But deadly temperatures for racialized people in the Americas began long before. So when did deadly heat begin? I suggest that we need to go back to Saint-Domingue and to Haiti. Centuries before climate change began to melt Arctic ice. In Saint-Domingue, many Africans died within a few years of stepping off the slave boats. The slave regime forced overwhelming heat exertion. The tropical climate was blameless. In Potosi, I suggest that we also look at what was happening with indigenous people. In Potosi and present-day Bolivia, the mining of valuable metals relied on the forced labor of indigenous people. Chiseling the metals from the earth exposed the miners to temperature extremes, and the ore refining processes exposed them to poisonous fumes. Then and now, efforts by privileged groups to escape disaster has been fraught. On sugar plantations, slaveholders built houses with wide verandas to maximize airflow and shade, but they found it hard to escape the diseases that swept the cane fields. On our warming planet, our mammalian bodies are a first line of defense. Thermoregulation enables humans and other mammals to maintain homeostasis, a stable body temperature as external temperatures change. When these autonomic responses are overwhelmed by extreme heat, deadly heat stroke can result. We have a second line of defense, practices of care and solidarity. And the first speaker spoke a bit about that, okay? We must attend to the needs of caregivers as higher temperatures become the new normal around the world. The scope of needs may overwhelm and burn out caregivers, physically and mentally, which may endanger themselves and those who depend on them. Mothers are often the ones who care for the most vulnerable groups, the very young and the very old. For the past couple of years, I've studied the care practices of Black and Latina mothers in South LA during hot summer months. The struggles of Esther and Beatrice exemplify their challenges. Extreme heat is already coming home for them because of problems with their housing and problems with neighborhoods. Compared to wider, more affluent areas in the city, South Los Angeles has less vegetation, including fewer parks to cool its streets, and many of its blocks have older residential buildings with poor insulation and a lack of air conditioning. Esther, a Haitian-American mother in her mid-30s, became alarmed when her little girl got a high fever that she feared was heat stroke. She sighs that she and her husband told the apartment manager and a housing inspector that the rundown building lacked proper insulation and needed central air, but they were rude to them and did nothing. Esther recently had a baby, and she says that the problems with the heat wave have increased her postpartum depression. Beatrice, a Latina mother in her mid-30s, describes feeling overwhelmed by the stench of the rodents in her family's broiling apartment. The mold that she worries will harm her little boy's lungs when he tries to cool off in the shower. And the landlord, whom she and her husband fear, will raise their rent and make them homeless if they complain. It's overwhelming how hot it is, she says. It's scary living like this. Me being a mother, I feel overwhelmed and stressed. I worry about my child getting heat stroke. These immigrant mothers are endangered not only by climate change, but also by a vicious rhetoric rooted in the history of racial capitalism that devalues their lives and justifies inequitable living conditions. In conclusion, I note that life has thrived in deserts and rainforests within survivable parameters for millennia. Cultures in these hot regions feel attached to their lands and have learned to live in them. Our challenge is to learn with them how to survive and thrive on a warming planet. To do so, we must support caregivers and build far-reaching solidarities. Beatrice, who I described a little bit earlier, migrated to Los Angeles from a region of southern Mexico with tropical thunderstorms that basted her town to a humid triple digits. Yet she calls her really, really warm home near a river, where neighbors would gather on hot nights to share barbecue and stories and chilled fruit drinks, as really, really nice, with its warm water, warm rain. I began with questions for you, and I leave you with questions. How do you imagine your future? Do you imagine a future of being one of the privileged few who can hole up in a solitary air-conditioned space, wrapped in a Kevlar blanket to keep from bursting into flames? Or can you imagine a future of solidarity, where we learn to appreciate warm water, warm rain together, in Beatrice's words, while taking action to maintain the temperature for all within survivable parameters? Thank you.
First of all, thank you all so much for spending your Sunday afternoon. Also thank MOCA for organizing this symposium to discuss what we can do to address climate change. And I'm going to spend the next 7 minutes to give you an example how climate change has impacted the drought and the wildfire over American West. We all know that American West is prone to drought and wildfire. It's nothing new. If we look at the history last millennium, we can see from time every couple of hundred years, South American West would experience a mega drought. And as you can see from these spikes down, and these mega drought really dwarf the worst drought we know in 20th century, such as 1930s and 1950s. However, since 1600, American West has experienced a mild climate, and therefore civilization flourished and American West become a very sought after place to live, including us, right? However, since the turn of 21st century, we are experiencing another mega drought, as you see in this chart. And this mega drought is comparable, perhaps even worse than the worst mega drought we know in the last millennium. And the question is this another mega drought, act of God? The answer is no. This is a man-made drought. And the main message, I hope, I'm going to present you the evidence to support this result. And also, the main message is this is the first time in human history we made a drought and we can influence the future of this mega drought. So I'm going to zoom in the last 50 years, and I apologize for the chart, it's too complicated, but the bottom line here is drought or surface dryness can be caused by either lack of rainfall or higher loss of moisture from soil, from plants, and that's driven by evaporative demand of the atmosphere water vapor, as that's my research area. And we all know evaporative demand can suck moisture out of anywhere they can. For example, during a hot, dry day, right, we feel the atmosphere is sucking moisture from our skin, and that's evaporative demand. However, throughout the history of the human being, that all the drought has been caused by lack of rainfall, including those mega drought in the last millennium. Therefore, all our mitigation strategy is centered at store rainwater, reservoirs such as. However, if we look at the most recent mega drought since 2000, and the precipitation hasn't changed much. And however, if we look at the evaporative demand, it's being tripled. As a result, our drought become twice as strong as the worst drought in last century, like 1930s and 1950s. And we can see more clearly through example of a most recent drought from 2020 to 2022. And this dark red indicate that over half of the Western US has experienced worse drought on our drought scale. Whereas if we remove climate change impact, and the drought caused by natural climate variability would be moderate drought. So this is a direct evidence of a climate impact making a moderate drought into an exceptional drought and unprecedented. Similarly, when you have a high moisture evaporative demand, and that's the most important condition for fire weather. And we usually use vapor pressure deficit to measure that. And in the last 20 years, the wildfire over Western US has nearly, burned area has nearly tripled. And if we look at the worst, largest fire, that August complex fire, I think Josh mentioned that. And we can see that this is a direct result of unprecedented higher evaporative demand, VPD here. And if we remove climate change impact, the vapor pressure deficit would be half. And definitely the fire weather would not be strong enough to support gigafire, which meaning burn more than 100 million acres. So it would be another wildfire, but not the largest fire California have ever experienced. So therefore, climate change is also the main cause for increased extreme fire weather, as well as extreme drought. So I want to conclude with, first of all, look at the impact of combined climate and the drought effect. It's multiply faster than we are prepared for. So you have a 2022 drought killed more than 36 million trees. On top of that, when you have a heat wave, and that just increases the flammability of the fuel, and that's a perfect recipe for extreme fire. And the combination of the fire, drought and the fire effect is 10 times of drought alone. Drought would cause a couple of billions over Western US. Drought and the fire is a couple of tens of billions. And if you increase the cascade effect on public health, disruption, supply chains, that's hundreds of billions cost. So that's far more than what we're prepared for. So I would like to end this presentation by positive message. And as I mentioned, for the first time, we have control on how this drought is going to develop. If we adopt a very aggressive action to control emission, let's say the sustainable scenario, and these kinds of drought and fire weather would increase some, but by in 20-something years, by middle century, it will be level off and start decreasing, start to getting better. But if we pursue business as usual fossil fuel development, and the drought, the worst drought we're seeing in 2020, 2022, that risk will increase more than 100 times. So that will be by just in 20 years. By the end of the century, it'll be 1 in 6 years events. So we will see that constantly. So therefore, our action really directly determine how these mega drought and extreme fire will develop or will be in the near future. And I think all the solutions discussed here really help us to avoid, I would say, catastrophic future for American West. Thank you very much.
First, thank you all for coming, and thank Josh Kline for his wonderful exhibit, and thanks very much to the invitation to MOCA for inviting me. So, Dr. Ramanathan, here comes some history. Okay, so historians have called the explosion of global economic growth after World War II the Great Acceleration. Unfortunately, the Great Acceleration of the economy accompanied a great acceleration of pollution and greenhouse gases. The Great Acceleration actually got its start not after World War II, but in the United States in the 1920s. Interrupted by depression and war, it exploded after the war with pent-up energy, spread to Europe in the 1960s and to the rest of the world at century's end. So what happened in the 1920s was that smokestack industrial capitalism transitioned into consumer capitalism. So let's take a closer look at how capitalism and pollution first accelerated. This is the most famous we'll start with this. This is the most famous light bulb in the world. It has its own webpage. It has its own Wikipedia page. The Centennial brand bulb made by the Shelby Electric Company has been glowing faithfully ever since it was installed in 1901 at the end of a cord in a fire station in Livermore, California. Other Shelby bulbs of similar vintage are also still functioning. A light bulb that never burns out is an environmentalist's dream. Imagine all the energy and resources needed to replace light bulbs for 125 years, plus the unrecyclable waste in landfills. Imagine also the other products that we might have that could last nearly indefinitely and never go out of style, without the associated waste, pollution, resource use, and greenhouse gases of endless replacements. But immortal light bulbs were part of an economic problem so serious that it helped cause the Great Depression. By the 1920s, a cornucopia of marvelous devices tempted the growing consumer class. However, they were durable. A home only needed to buy one of each. By 1927, the market for durable goods was getting saturated. Demand slackened, inventories grew, factory orders dropped, unemployment rose. Demand dropped more, factories closed, banks closed, and down the spiral we went into the deepest depression in world history. Corporate leaders recognized the problem. In 1924, light bulb manufacturers formed an international cartel and standardized the life expectancy of light bulbs at 1,000 hours. Overnight, light bulb owners became perpetual light bulb consumers. Planned obsolescence was born, and all those durable goods soon became a good deal less durable. 1920s also saw the popularity of the safety razor, the first common product designed to be used once and thrown away, followed quickly by Kotex and Kleenex and much more. These all blazed the way, the one-way route from manufacturer to consumer to the dump. Also in 1924, a corporation came up with an effective new strategy to get consumers to buy an item not once but repeatedly. Half of all automobiles were Ford Model Ts when Alfred P. Sloan of General Motors introduced annual model year changes in styling and features to sow dissatisfaction with older models and entice consumers to buy the latest model. This fiendishly successful strategy catapulted GM's auto sales past Ford's. Getting people to replace cars and other goods with newer, more stylish models is the job of advertising, which came into its own in the 1920s. Using techniques from the new field of psychology, advertisers used sex, social insecurity, and status to sell luxuries and novelties that soon became necessities, or stirred dissatisfaction that led to replacing old items with new ones. New mass media, magazines, movies, whoops, where's my mass media slide? Okay, this is the old old presentation. Okay, there's a mess. There we go. New mass media, magazines, movies, and radio gave advertisers ways to reach a mass audience. At the same time, back we go. Businessmen figured out new ways of giving consumers quick gratification of their desires. Installment plans proliferated to encourage people to buy what they could not yet afford. And the charge card, ancestor to the modern credit card, was also introduced. Then, too, in the 1920s, household items were made from, again, these slides are out of order, were made from something in nature. Cellophane and bakelite heralded a new age of non-biodegradable plastics and artificial materials produced from dangerous chemicals extracted from fossil fuels. One more vital factor, here we go back, made it possible for a consumer economy to replace the producer economy. An energy transition from coal to oil and gas began and inaugurated a century of cheap, plentiful energy. Low-cost energy made possible cheaper, more plentiful consumer goods and freed up income to buy them. Energy use also skyrocketed. We have here on this chart really quickly, this is wages over time. This is Switzerland after World War II, but it applies to many different countries at different times. We have the price of bread here, and we have the price of gas and the price of energy. So you notice wages go up, and also the price of bread, also the price of coal would track that because bread and coal require labor to extract. This is not true of oil and gas, which you drill it and then you attach a pump and the pipelines and you don't need any more labor. So it detaches the price of energy from the price, from the cost of labor, which means now a laborer has got all this extra income to buy goods and to buy more energy. Growth is consumer capitalism's mantra, which it now achieves through continually increasing production and marketing of non-essential goods. Consumer capitalism took shape in the 1920s to remedy saturation of the market. The faster we spend, the faster money goes from one person to another, putting more money into more hands and raising incomes and living standards. Of course, the more energy that goes in and resources that go in, the more waste, pollution, and greenhouse gases that go out. Such trends baffled conservationists, baffled conservationist program of careful use to keep resources for future generations. Advertising, consumer capitalism's essential propaganda wing, promotes values antithetical to conservation. In the 1920s, magazines, radios, and movies first seriously competed with family, religion, schools, and peers as sources of values. Traditional moral values of sobriety, self-denial, industry, thrift, and community do not sell consumer products. Indeed, advertisements and mass entertainment promote pleasure, self-gratification, entertainment, consumption, and the individual. So successful, so effective have they been that anybody touting older values today sounds positively priggish. We are all consumers now. By the end of the century, large corporations and concentrations of capital had grown enormously powerful in both the economy and politics. Radio, then television, the internet, and now smartphones push consumerist values constantly and everywhere. We are immersed in a sea of corporate propaganda, from morning to night, from birth until death. Like characters in an ad or a film in TV, we all aspire to individual fulfillment and expression of our individual identities, and we do it by buying things. And meanwhile, credit cards, internet one-click shopping, and the smartphone make it ever easier to buy without actually having the money. In the 1970s and 80s, rather than modernize American factories, corporations found it much more profitable to move manufacturing to nations with cheap labor and weak environmental and business regulations. American, European, and Japanese skies and rivers grew cleaner at the expense of Chinese, Indian, and Mexican environments. The Ganges today is a fetid sewer, and air in Beijing, New Delhi, and Mexico City often unbreathable. What is to be done? Consumer capitalism is undoubtedly to blame for the environmental crisis, just as undoubtedly consumer capitalism has given us a good life. Consumer capitalism produced huge wealth, lowered prices, and in the long run made life easier and longer. It cannot do so forever unless some wizard conjures an economy that sells more with less energy and fewer resources. So we find ourselves on a wild ride on a merry-go-round, whirling dizzily round and round, and no one yet knows quite how to get off. Thank you.
So thank you to Kelsey for the invitation and to the entire staff at MOCA for putting this together. I'll be speaking today about the idea of thermal inequality and how we might work towards what I'm calling something like thermal justice, right? So it was really in India that I began thinking about the problem of heat. In the summer of 2015, I was in India conducting research for my first book on the treatment of tuberculosis in the face of growing antibiotic resistance. I took a train to the outskirts of Delhi to visit a former sanatorium, which was now an important public hospital, where patients gathered in the hopes of receiving therapies for drug-resistant forms of tuberculosis. But when I arrived, there was no one there. There were no patients. I walked around the hospital searching for someone to speak to, and I found a few doctors huddled in the on-call room, the only room in the hospital fitted with an air conditioner. They had told their patients to come back another day because it was just too hot. Somehow I hadn't noticed. I knew it was hot for me, but coming from New York at the time, I didn't have a good sense of what was too hot for those who worked and lived in and around Delhi. That day in the hospital in Delhi got me thinking about the ways in which heat impacts our bodies, our health, and our health systems. Not all of us suffer the calamitous effects of heat in the same way and to the same degree. This is an idea I've been referring to as thermal inequality, and which I define through three primary dimensions. The first involves the unequal distribution of the negative effects of heat. So to be clear, I'm not just saying that some parts of the world are hotter than others. We already know that, right? Thermal inequality isn't just about where it's hotter, it's about who is most punished by the heat, who faces its negative consequences economically, sociologically, biologically. This leads me then into the second dimension of thermal inequality. Extreme heat disproportionately affects those who have been made vulnerable by a host of other pre-existing forms of social harm. So we might think here of racial discrimination, lack of citizenship, class and caste-based inequalities, rampant ableism, sexism, ageism, the list goes on. Just to give you an example, anyone here felt the Santa Ana winds on Friday? Yeah, a few folks? Those winds carry away untold number of senior citizens, right? So every year we have these heat waves, we have these spikes caused by Santa Anas, and we have mass death amongst elderly populations here in Los Angeles, right? But we often don't see that. We don't realize that we can have a heat wave in the middle of the winter. Thermal inequality is like a magnifying glass, exacerbating the various forms of inequality that already structure our societies. The third dimension of thermal inequality builds on the first two. Thermal inequality tends to operate like a zero-sum game. Many people labor under extreme heat, sorting boxes in sweltering warehouses, delivering packages in vehicles without air conditioning, or working in fields under the midday sun, so that others don't have to. The safety and comfort of some depends directly on the discomfort, debilitation, and death of others. So I've been researching how our bodies respond to extreme heat, and I've come to the realization that exposure to heat will become one of the defining public health and civil rights issues of the 21st century. In 2020, is this the right? Yeah, there we go. In 2020, I founded the UCLA Heat Lab, an interdisciplinary research team that studies thermal inequality in various forms, especially here in California. I want to focus very quickly in the time that I have on three projects with three different groups of people that we've kind of worked on over the years. So during the height of the pandemic, food trucks became an important source of nutrition, of meals for many of my students at UCLA who couldn't go to the dining halls anymore because of the necessity of kind of spacing, right? So my students wanted to understand how hot does it get inside of these trucks that we've all been to. And so we use these little buttons called eye buttons in order to track temperatures inside of food trucks. What we learned, so we place eye buttons in the prep area, the cooking area near the windows. We learned that it can get up to 109 degrees Fahrenheit inside of these trucks, even on a cool evening. We also learned that there's a lot of variation in terms of how hot a truck gets, depending on where you are in the truck. So what produced these conditions? Obviously, part of it is outdoor temperatures. Obviously, part of it's body heat. How many people are inside of one of these trucks? There's also the heat produced by the cooking element. There were also, however, structural elements that exacerbated the heat. So, for example, AC units, when they existed, and they often didn't exist, were often placed near the ceiling so that the cool air would be sucked right out. And that was partially because of the concern about air conditioners pushing, for example, bacteria and germs into the food that you would eat, right? Back doors were kept closed, partially because there was a concern about robbery, but also because food safety regulations don't allow you to keep those back doors open, right? So there's a real strong tension here between kind of consumer safety, food safety, and occupational health, right? And the state of California comes out on the side of the consumer. So kind of tying right back to our previous presentation, really in California, we value the health of those who eat and not those who work. So we interviewed workers to get a quick sense, or get a good sense of how they experience the heat. Workers told us they often work alone or in pairs. So taking a break is incredibly difficult. They often work several hours in a row without a break. As you can see from this quote, you know, the kind of intensive physical symptoms that folks experience working in these spaces. But I really want to kind of point to is the fact that we heard again and again from the owners of trucks that they tended to hire Black, Latinx, and Asian American workers. The reason why they told us is because white workers fainted on the first day of the job, right? So there was an idea that there's a kind of racial, biological susceptibility that some people experience, and some people are somehow more immune to the heat, right? We also heard this from workers of color. So we hear from Indonesian, Mexican, Indian workers telling us, I can handle this because somehow in my DNA. Just to be clear, this is entirely false, right? This is also at the basis, as we've learned, of the history of slavery, history of indentures, right? The idea that certain people can handle heat and others cannot is the foundation of kind of modern economy based on some people being exposed to extreme heat and other people kind of being safe from it, right? I'm gonna speed up a little bit. So a second project I want to talk about very, very briefly involves our work in Watts, which is a primarily Black and Latinx neighborhood here in Los Angeles. Watts is formerly redlined. Redlined areas in the United States tend to be much hotter than surrounding areas. In Watts specifically is 4.7 degrees hotter Fahrenheit than surrounding wider neighborhoods. And this is, due to decades of disinvestment in terms of lack of trees, in terms of, low-income renters of color who don't have air conditioning in their homes. There is no right to cooling in California or in much of the country. I've spoken to, for example, representatives of Los Angeles City Council. I've spoken to landlord unions. And what I'm told over and over again is that cooling is simply a luxury. It's not a necessity. But in fact, people are dying in their homes. They're dying in their workplaces. They're dying on the playgrounds because it's in fact too hot. And air conditioning is in fact necessary for survival. Right? I'm going to keep moving very, very quickly. I'm so sorry. I'm terrible at timing because I'm an academic. The final project, and this is kind of near and dear to my heart. So earlier this year, Governor Newsom signed into law what's called an indoor heat standard. The idea was to protect laborers across California in those warehouses and all kinds of workplaces from extreme heat, with one major exception: prisons and jails, right? Carceral facilities. Even though incarcerated people are in fact workers who are paid almost nothing, and you have correctional workers, you have healthcare workers in those facilities. The reason why we were told is because it would cost billions to cool prisons and jails. So a colleague of mine, Nick Shapiro, who runs the Carceral Ecologies Lab at UCLA, we basically argue that there's a way around this, right? If you can't pay to cool them down, close them down, right? So a kind of abolitionist strategy to kind of insist that if you providing cooling in prisons is a constitutional obligation, right? So we have in the United States a kind of insistence that we cannot deliver cruel and unusual punishment, and yet people are dying in our prisons. And the day before this op-ed came out, a woman died in Chinchilla prison in Central California, right, from the extreme heat, although California still says they don't know what caused it, right? So, I mean, just to kind of end, as I have 45 seconds left, working towards thermal justice in all of these situations, it's not simply and only about providing air condition. Air-conditioned prison is still a prison, right, fundamentally. And so what I want to kind of end with is to kind of say that what it means to work towards thermal justice and climate justice is to work towards racial and economic justice, right? So if we don't understand fundamentally that what makes people vulnerable, what makes them unsafe, what causes them to fall in the face of climate change is these pre-existing deep-seated inequalities, we won't understand how to really produce real climate adaptation. Thank you so much.
Rong, would you like to join us? We're going to have a brief conversation. If Josh could come down. There's Josh. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rong. So, as an artist, when MOCA reached out 5 years ago saying, let's make an environmental council, I started to learn more about the museum. And one aspect is this museum is a civic museum, which means it's for the people and it's for the local communities. And the other is that it was founded by artists. And that to me meant activism, doing action in motion toward change. The speakers that just joined us today are all educators. They're all local minds who are focused on learning and moving that learning into wisdom and into shared knowledge. And so I can't think of anything better than to have just listened to those 4 presentations and also more prescient to Josh's exhibition. When we were looking at effects, we focused on fossil fuels, right? If there was one major emissions reduction effort, would be fossil fuels. In looking, in causes, and now in looking at effects, one thing that's been coming up quite a lot is heat. So we're really sort of basis on heat and social welfare in terms of people's well-being and their health. So I'd like to begin with heat for the questions, and you can text in questions as you'd like. Josh, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I have a comment more than a question, because I feel like there were these threads through all of your presentations, like starting with Alesia's, which to me comes back to questions of responsibility. Like, where do these come from? Like connecting local history, global history, like connecting local circumstances, global circumstances, and then connecting these both with history, connecting with responsibility, like who has benefited from these conditions, from these, from this way of life, who has profited, and then who is responsible for ameliorating it, you know? And I think like looking back at those images of like those drawings of the mines in Potosi and in Haiti, historically gets to something that I think is important to foreground when thinking about the climate crisis, which doesn't often get discussed, which is like the roots of it in the empires of the 19th century and colonialism. Like if you look at the roots of this, the ultimate roots of it, we're looking at slavery, colonialism, and empire. Like the mining of silver and gold in Mexico and Peru, financed by the Spanish conquerors, financed the plantation slavery in the Caribbean and in the Americas, the proceeds of which powered the initial industrial revolutions in England, the United States, Western Europe, then Japan, which has ignited all of this, like the ultimate root cause of human-made climate change in its current catastrophic implications. So I don't know, I mean, I feel like it's like coming back to these questions, it's important to understand where things come from. And I don't know, it was just great to hear your presentations and to think about this.
So sorry, there's so many questions coming in. So can anyone here speak to the historical reasons in terms of heat in the greater LA area for the widespread lack of tree cover across the county? Why are there these sort of heat points? Why are there less trees? And is it in part a social enterprise to avoid rest, to avoid loitering, or is it just a lack of financing for tree cover and shade? You have microphones.
Can you hear me? I can't speak to why overall there might be fewer trees than in other places, but I can speak to why there are disparities. They're related to the history, in part related to the history of redlining that was across the United States. And this is true, so this is true across the United States, that in Black and immigrant communities. Does everyone know what redlining was?
If you could
Well, some of
define it
you are.
briefly, that would be great.
Sure. So there was, back in the early part of the 20th century, there was, to make it short, because as an academic, there was disinvestment in areas that were considered to be poor investments. So there wouldn't be home investment in those areas. And there also tended to be less investment in businesses in those areas. Those are called redline areas. There's a complex argument about what exactly the maps that were used for redlining. So these were maps that would be literally redline, that you shouldn't invest in particular areas. And so there's a bit of a debate about, well, which maps were responsible for disinvestment. But anyway, because of that disinvestment, some areas were considered to be poor investment, so that there wouldn't be as much investment by the city government and by private entities. And so that partially explains why you see fewer trees and fewer parks in redline areas. Did you want to add?
So I would just say trees are expensive, right? Trees require to be planted. They're required to be maintained and watered for the first several years. In Los Angeles, as in many places, it is the responsibility of homeowners to take care of these trees, especially in the first couple of years. In redline neighborhoods where you don't necessarily have as many homeowners, you have renters, you have low-income renters, those trees are not planted, they're not taken care of, right? The city does not take responsibility for it either. And so you have, in a sense, a kind of push towards greener, wealthier neighborhoods, and then you have poorer neighborhoods of color with fewer trees. And then you also have this kind of push towards the ubiquitous palm tree, which is amongst the most beautiful and useless trees that one can possibly imagine, right? They provide almost no shade if you ever were to walk, down Sunset or really anywhere in Los Angeles, right? But these trees are part of a certain kind of a desire to advertise Los Angeles as this kind of beautiful Mediterranean-ish place where people come from all over the country, all over the world, right? And so it takes on a certain kind of iconic value, and it's not really thinking about who needs these trees in order to survive, in order to live here.
Sort of a follow-up. Oh, please go back.
Yeah, I have something to add. I mean, talking about the history of it, one of the reasons is that the people who moved to LA, especially originally, tended to come from the southern part of the US, and there was very little tradition of any communal kind of spaces. And so the idea was, well, just let private entities develop LA, and so it was given to the developers who are not going to make any money if they have land that they don't develop, like in a park, an open space. So you make a lot more money if you put houses over everything. And so that's pretty much explains a lot of LA's development. Whereas Northern California has a lot more New Englanders, which have the traditions of village greens and, the commons. And it's actually where city and state and the national parks originated, was from that part of the United States, providing something for the community for democratic purposes. So you get San Francisco with lots and lots of parks.
Yeah, it has a lot of parks.
But you think of LA and it's like there's hardly any parks. What do you think of, what's the name of that famous cemetery? This huge cemetery. What's
Forever Cemetery?
Anyway.
A follow-up on that, and maybe, would you like to say something, Alesia?
Just quickly, I just want to say that planting trees is not necessarily the answer, that it depends on the kinds of trees that you plant, that you can actually make a problem worse in certain parts of the country for ecological reasons that I don't have time to go into. But also planting trees can be an investment strategy for areas that are undergoing gentrification. And so that the people there who need shade may not be able to live there because trees and planting gardens and so forth increase gentrification. So there needs to be really careful strategies about ecological development in those areas.
I really appreciate you bringing that up, because in the space that I work with, which is land conservation, there's been a shift more recently to plant trees, because it's just, people think that they can number it, right? It's a metric-based thing. And it's a very politicized and very challenging discourse. So thank you for bringing that up. That leads into the next question. What can Angelenos do to fight heat equality in this city? What is something that's effective for heat equality for families? If you'd like to follow up with that, because I know this is your specialty.
I mean, there's just so many. I mean, first of all, I think a lot of things require collective action, right? It's not simply about showing up at the ballot box. But, there are, for example, in city council, there's a push towards a right for cooling for tenants, right? This, to my mind, is absolutely essential. Guess who doesn't want that, right? A lot of folks who represent wealthier parts of LA, a lot of pro kind of landlord unions, and they argue that it'll be too expensive. And again, that it's a luxury, right? So, for example, voting in to power those who do support, for example, tenants' rights, I think is one concrete, important thing we can do.
Wrong.
Yeah, I would like to add that in the thorough research is very important, because in other major cities, the climate have been working with social scientists, urban planning, to simulate what would be the best benefit for the bank you can cool the city. And it's actually complicated issue. It's not just plant the tree, but also where you put your solar panel, how you structure the city. I really feel this kind of research need to be done for Los Angeles area to help us come up with the most effective strategy to cool the city.
Yeah, and for people who are focused on institutions and museums, a few years ago, the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation came forward with the Climate Initiative grants, and they've been exceptionally successful. And they were sort of focused on two things. One, shifting museums to renewable energy or to reduce their energy consumption, because energy was the largest sort of part of the pie graph for museums for their emissions, their carbon emissions production. The other thing is that for the annual year-over-year budget, energy tends to be the largest budget item for a museum. So ideally, if they were shifting to solar, they could reduce the amount they were paying, but they could also reduce their emissions. With that in mind, that's an example of a collective effort that was looking at both adaptation and mitigation. So adaptation is essentially changing what we got to try to adapt to changing climate. Mitigation is sort of trying to avoid that climate changing. So not necessarily changing our infrastructure, but hey, let's get ahead of the problem and not need to change our infrastructure. So those two terms, adaptation and mitigation, you're gonna hear a lot in the coming forever. And I think that the difficulty is that with adaptation, you're looking at suffering, right? Like you're adapting because of widespread suffering.
I mean, this is something that I think doesn't get communicated strongly enough, is what do those degrees of warming mean in terms of human suffering in the world? I remember, I think it was in The Uninhabitable Earth. Why am I forgetting his name? David Wallace Wells' Uninhabitable Earth, where he was breaking it down that every, 0.1 degree of warming was going to result in some massive number of deaths. Like if you could keep Like even at 1.5 degrees of warming, we're talking about like, I don't know, 100 million people dying because of climate-related disasters.
And billions of other species.
And billions of other species. And then as it goes up, approaching 2 degrees, we're talking about billions of people dying. And then if you reach 5 degrees or 6 degrees, which like thankfully it looks like we are not on track for anymore, then you're talking about human extinction. And I think that gets lost. People throw these numbers around without, again, connecting them to human life and like human suffering.
Thank you.
I think one of the points of my presentation is that this is a difficult problem, it's very intractable, and it's really, actually, the problem is, I mean, it's all it's tied up with everything. Yeah. So that the adaptation and the mitigation that Dr. Ramanathan mentioned, it's probably a lot more realistic and probably more necessary, because societal transformation is like, that's incredibly difficult to try to achieve by anybody. Well, and we have the huge, I mean, you think of the trillions of dollars invested in oil and gas infrastructure, everything from mineral rights to the pumping to the pipelines and the tankers and I mean, it goes on and on. These companies are not going to walk away from that. And we had, for example, BP was like, we're going to go green. We're going to do green energy. So they started to move in that direction, and then they recently, in the last year or two, moved back because there's no money in it.
We have a question directly for you about that. Ask Mark how consumers get off the hamster wheel. How do we get off the hamster wheel of consumer capitalism?
What's that?
How do we get off the hamster wheel of consumer capitalism?
Well, that's the problem, because I mean, we did stop consuming once. That was 1929, which, you know, it actually needs us to keep consuming in order to keep it going, because people talk about like some sort of steady state or something that we can reach. I don't think that exists in nature. Everything grows and rises, or it declines or collapses. And to try to keep anything at a steady state, I'm a historian, you look at history, when does that ever happen? It's in a complex, we have 8 billion people. We have to support those people. How are we going to do that? Keeping them alive, keeping them fed. We certainly can't keep them in a situation, you know, like we live in, which is beyond the capacity of the Earth to do. In fact, what we're doing now is beyond the capacity of the Earth. So it seems to me the challenge really is to keep the economy going at the same time as reducing our resource use and our energy use. But how you do that, I don't know.
I don't know. I heard an interesting statistic recently, which was that if you took all of the land that's currently being used for growing like eco-fuels like corn, ethanol, and put solar panels on it, you could power the United States 3 times over. Like just if you took that farmland in the country. I mean, I think that, you know, the sun is like a boundless source of energy. There's plenty of power to, you know, provide for everybody.
How would you do it?
I mean, how do you find the will?
What we need is the politics is what we need to focus on.
Well, I think some of this comes out of your presentation, actually, you know, which is advertising, which is something that I'm very interested in. You know, like I'm always saying this, so anybody who's heard me before, I apologize. You know, we live in a country that can sell cancerous chemicals to children as breakfast cereal, you know, and make them desire it. I mean, I think fondly of all the cancerous breakfast cereals that I ate as a child. You know, like I wish that I could eat them now, but you know, and yet we can't sell like health insurance and trees and cooling and all these things that people want to the population, like free health insurance, which everybody wants. Why is it not possible to sell this to the American public as a desirable political goal? And the same with not roasting to death in an overheated future. Like this is a communications issue.
We could absolutely do that. It's the problem is the people with the most money for advertising don't want it. But we have oil and gas, which is the largest source of climate misinformation for the past 30 years, which is why people aren't accepting the science. And it's not because, I mean, we could say the scientists haven't done a good job of communicating. Like, well, if they had money to hire Madison Avenue to present it, they probably would, but we don't have the money.
Yeah.
The
That is a
people
good
with the
point.
money
That's a really good point.
are
It's
invested in
necessary.
oil and gas. So, I mean, it's a really
well
hard
said,
problem.
Very well said. A question for Bharat. Where is the prison air conditioning issue now? Is there an ongoing lawsuit? If not, should there be? And what is the aspects of the regulations, the legal instantiations in the future of people who are incarcerated being kept cool?
It's a great question. So there's a series of lawsuits across New York, Texas, California, often filed by the families of incarcerated people, legal advocates to kind of push for either cooling or early release or other forms of kind of maintaining the health of those who are incarcerated while they're incarcerated. The problem is the way in which the legal structure of prisons work in the United States is that they're piecemeal, right? So if, for example, you create a change for one person in one prison in one city in California, that applies to nobody else, whether that be another person in that prison or in someone in a different prison, right? So we have a problem, the way in which the legal system has been kind of restructured under Clinton, actually, allows for the most minimalist possible interventions, right? So this is the real challenge here. Obviously, legally, there are limitations of what can be done. Politically, there are no limitations, right? So this is where I think it's really important to push, at the same time, people do need cooling immediately because they are dying right now in prisons. On the other hand, we need to end prisons, right? We need to think about, abolishing policing, abolishing prisons as climate strategies. These are fundamentally about climate adaptation. It doesn't matter whether your politics lean left or right. If you're concerned about climate change, you should be concerned about prisons and police.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that. This is a follow-up for Alesia. What constitutes a heat-related illness or death? How many heat-related deaths go undocumented, unacknowledged compared to those that do?
There's no way, that's an excellent question. There's really no way of knowing how many deaths are heat-related for a number of reasons, because the most vulnerable people to heat are people with chronic conditions, right? And so oftentimes what happens is that what gets listed on the death certificate is that chronic condition that people have. But it was the combination of the heat and the chronic condition that led to the death. So yeah, that's an excellent question. It deserves more study and more careful documentation. But I can't answer that question because of the way in which heat deaths are recorded.
And the immensity of it. I mean, it's.
Yeah, but perhaps if there was more of a will to document it, that we could do a better job of it than we're doing now.
So that brings us back to compassion and empathy and care.
And political so I think that the base of things that I agree with everybody here who's you probably could see from my presentation that we need to have more compassion and so that we can have more solidarity. But the next step from that is, I think, organizing and mobilizing and engaging in collective action to bring about change. Because sometimes what happens is that we just have the performance of movement. We have people who are very well-intentioned, who talk about that we need to move towards solidarity, and we have experiences of maybe of sharing a meal together, but we don't actually move to bringing about the things like better documentation of heat-related deaths and addressing them. And so we need to move to that step as well.
Thank you. Rong, this is a question for you in regards to droughts and in water vapor. Can you speak a little bit to the science behind water vapor and droughts and what you think the catastrophic effects are going to be of these droughts, if that's mostly food related or if that will also be drinking water related, and what we can do as, all of us here. What is one thing we can do to help go in the right direction with the situation in the future, if we're talking about one major drought every 6 years?
Thank you. The how drought is being affected by water vapor, and as I mentioned, if drought can be caused by losing more moisture from soil, plants, and if you have a higher temperature and the atmosphere can hold a lot more water vapor, as a result, it's going to suck vapor from anywhere it can. Usually surface plants are the main source for them, the river and the reservoir. So the impact of a temperature-induced drought is much harder than, to mitigate the effect, it's much harder than mitigate precipitation-induced drought, because for precipitation-induced drought, you build a big reservoir, you store the water, and you can use them during the drought. The problem with temperature-driven drought is it happened over much larger area for much longer time. Even you have normal rainfall, they don't make to reservoir. They all evaporated, sucked by atmosphere. So it's far difficult to really mitigate the impact. In terms of what do we do? I mean, people talk about I know in Texas, they talk about maybe spread oil over reservoir to reduce the evaporation loss because of higher temperature, because that water loss sometimes is greater than all the municipal use of water. But first and foremost, the water has to make the reservoir, and we cannot do much about that. So I think the only way I could see mitigating is really not to let temperature raise so high. And that not only will mitigate the impact of climate change on drought, but also reduce the extremeness of the fire weather. So it's really the reduce the emission of the greenhouse gases.
Thank you. We do have an arts follow-up question, unless you have one you'd like to say. As an environmental science professor at an arts college, so environmental science professor at arts college, what, if any, priority to a land ethic, environmental economics, or social justice should I expose the next generation of artists to? So I think this is a two-part question. Like, being in integrity, what is our responsibility as educators to sort of integrate environmental economics or environmental justice into our teachings? And is this a priority? How do you determine your pedagogic work considering what's unfolding? Go for it, Alesia. Yeah, thank you.
I think interdisciplinary approaches are necessary. That in my environmental justice class for both my undergraduates and my graduate students, I expose them to, and sometimes bring in artists, I bring in scientists, I bring in people from the humanities, I bring in social scientists, that we need to be able to speak across disciplines and to understand other work in order to solve the problems that we're facing. That's very difficult because the ways in which our universities are structured, we are taught to specialize, and it's very hard to have conversations across disciplines. But I find that the students really appreciate that. And that we need to develop those kinds of minds, that we're keeping science in our head, we're keeping the social science of how human beings respond to heat, mental health problems, and so forth, and that we're also opening ourselves up to the future. And I think that the artists have a particular role for that, everywhere that I've studied environmental justice problems, it's the artists who are at the forefront of organizing people, because because if you just tell people things are really bad, which some activists or researchers do, things are real, then there's no people don't have a but artists open us up to feeling how bad things are, and also a vision of how things could be.
That's beautifully said. We do have 2 more questions, even though I'd like to end on that note, because that's very positive. One is about policing. How is policing related to climate change? Just because you mentioned that, that was a really big thing to say.
Yeah, I don't think it's a big thing to say, actually. I think it's kind of fundamental, and I think it's because we separate out things like racial and economic justice from climate justice that we think of these things as quite disparate, right? So let's think about the budget of Los Angeles, right? If you've seen the signs that I think our auditor has put up billboards across the city, you will know that LAPD gets far more funding than literally everything else, right? Imagine putting just a modicum of those funds into climate adaptation, right? Imagine how that would transform the city. Imagine public transportation. Imagine being able to take a bus or a train here rather than taking an Uber or a car, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing to keep in mind, in a more kind of concrete, specific way, is that policing is part of the carceral state, right? So to get someone to a prison requires them being arrested. And so putting more and more money into policing people, especially policing communities of color, lower income communities, means that more folks who are already experiencing extreme heat in their homes without air conditioning then end up in prison cells without air conditioning, right? And so you have basically, you're basically constantly in these microclimates that are threatening to kill you, right? And so to my mind, funding policing, funding the carceral state, all of this is very much anti kind of climate adaptation agenda.
I want to jump in on that. Thank you for that. I think, we can also look at this nationally, like in terms of the United States' policies. Like, it's important to keep in mind that the United States is the richest country on earth, by far, and yet it refuses to tax its wealthy. And this is also a big problem, because with a limited pot of money, which has shrunk since the pandemic, because of this refusal to tax, there's only so much that we can do, and the U.S. spends the majority of its taxpayer dollars on the military and also servicing its debt. And because of that, like if we don't raise taxes and we need to solve these problems, where do we get the money from? Well, one of the answers is, potentially by spending less of it on like the U.S. military. Something that came up in the last climate day of talks that Haley and I did in New York last year was that the U.S. military is like the largest contributor to global climate change in the world. It's worth keeping that in mind.
Thank you. We have 2 final questions, and there should be a lot of debate from both of them, but the first is sort of a hybrid. How should we address the issue of mass production in a world where the majority of the population, due to their economic limitations, lacks the ability to choose the resources they consume? And who has the greatest responsibility in slowing this consumer capitalism, the consumer, the industry, or the government? Why don't you begin?
Sounds like it's for me. Well, I don't know that mass production is the problem. It actually, mass production made things cheaper and improved the lives of the poor, because they didn't have to make their own clothes or their own shoes or go without, and so on. Made our homes better built and warmer in the winter and so on. It just goes on and on. It made literacy much more widespread because books were cheaper and newspapers were cheaper. So mass production is, the people who advocated mass production and put it into effect in the first place were often very moral people and thought they were doing a good thing. by making things cheaply available to people. So it also put people to work who were very poor to begin with. So it's complicated. So mass production actually makes things available to poor people. What was the second part was how do we slow consumer capitalism? Well, I kind of addressed this a little earlier.
Who's the responsible party? Is it regulators? Is it the consumers buying? Is it?
Well, I mean, we're all
businesses?
consumers, and so, like I say, we all have incredible diets, and we drive around vehicles, and we can jump into an airplane and fly across, the opposite end of the world, which is just like magical to previous generations, we think very little about it. So we all benefit, everybody who's here, because we don't have to go back to our hovel and labor in the fields for our dinner, or whatever it may be. So it's, like I said, I think that it's a wheel that's impossible to stop without all sorts of unintended consequences. When it stopped in 1929, not only did people go out of work, but all sorts of political extremism arose around the world. It was disastrous globally in so many different ways. So, you know, you have to be careful what you wish for. So we have to do this very carefully. It seems to me we need to kind of nudge and direct and try to push consumer capitalism into less destructive and more productive, less environmentally destructive ways. And that's going to take a lot of creativity by people who, some of whom are in office, and others threatening to come into office who would stop it all. So politics is important.
Politics is important, voting is important, and Frank, culture? Culture is important.
Culture is the dynamic that we've not talked about, that Josh is kind of representative of that, is that there has to be a culture of a smaller footprint, inspired by people who want to see that change. I don't know the answer to the question.
Thank you.
So it's how do we get people to take a responsibility for their footprint?
I want to say something about this because I have an installation upstairs called Personal Responsibility, and some people take it literally when it's actually, it's an indictment. Like I learned recently, actually, when I was installing the show here in LA, that the idea of a personal carbon footprint was something that BP spread around as part of a PR strategy, that they invented the idea of a personal carbon footprint in order to displace responsibility from themselves onto individuals. So people would spend time calculating their individual, nanoscale contribution to the global climate crisis instead of looking at what BP and the governments that support it are doing. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Like, while we should be doing things in our own lives to try and contribute to this problem, it is really at the scale of governments and militaries and corporations. And that, I think, personally, for me, is like where we really need to be acting.
With that in mind, this symposium on climate change landscapes on the edge has the word land in it. And the majority of my work is with land, and that really is regulatory based. Like when you have the right laws, when you have the language of law in your hands, you can support culture going in a unified direction. Because if anything, climate is sort of all of us, right? It was mentioned earlier, if one state makes a change, but they all don't make a change, it's not gonna be enough. And so that's why we begin this work with education, just learning, becoming more aware, having a force multiplier effect, bringing your friends. And this brings us to our last question, which returns us to heat in terms of effects. Can you speak to the thermal justice struggles in the local LAUSD public schools and schoolyards, thinking in particular about failing buildings, insulation and AC, which is not working, in schools, as well as usage of things like artificial turf and black asphalt that raise surface temperatures substantially from already extreme temperatures to unsustainable for children?
Okay. Yeah, so LAUSD schools, like many schools across the country, are incredibly dangerous places for many students. We see this primarily in schools that serve Black and brown kids, kids from poor communities, for a variety of reasons. One, you have these classrooms that are incredibly hot, right, without air conditioning. And there's been research showing that if you go to school in a hot classroom, you experience significant learning loss that accumulates, it builds up, right? So by the time you try to apply to college, you've lost a lot, you're testing less well. This is why, for me, it's a thermal inequality issue. It really builds on a pre-existing kind of inequality and just makes it worse, right? But then you have the kind of really more concrete thing of kids who are going outside for recess and they're falling on the ground from heat exhaustion. They're literally burning their hands on slides and monkey bars, right? Because it's incredibly hot out there. Part of the difficulty is that if you try to change those into, say, astroturf or into grass, if you try to plant trees, it's incredibly expensive. Again, it requires schools to also become ADA compliant because you have to kind of do both, which costs more money, which is money that schools don't have, right? This kind of, not to be a broken record, but what if we didn't invest in policing and we invested in schools, right? What would that look like? To imagine, to be able to transform a school, make it ADA compliant, but also make it green, plant trees, make it safer for students, make it possible for them to learn, right? So this is a huge issue, absolutely, and not just in California.
Thank you to all of our speakers. In a moment, we're going to take a 5-minute break and come back with Mike dead. And we will spend, we'll have 4 presentations, each 7 minutes on solutions by exceptional minds. But we'd like to thank you very much for your time today. That was an exceptional panel.
Thank you so much. That was a great conversation.